a German pilot known as O Ariete, because he simply took down several aircraft by ramming his Me-262 jet directly into them. And this guy had one of the most incredible endings you'll ever hear about in your life. Want to know his story? Stick with us. So, Eduard Schallmoser was born on October 4, 1923 in a small town called Ain, southeast of Munich. He would be the first of three boys, the other two named Rupert and Rudolf, sons of Eduard Schallmoser and Johanna Schallmoser. Their father died at the age of 40 on September 18, 1940. So Johanna, widowed and with three young boys to raise, moved to the city of Memmingen, east of Munich. There, in 1941, at the age of 18, Eduard Schallmoser, Johanna's eldest son, joined the military service and became a soldier in the Luftwaffe, serving as part of the German Air Force ground crew. In 1943, his brother Rupert also turned 18 and was drafted into military service, serving in the Army, and there he would die in action in 1944 at the age of 19. During this period, the tide of the war had clearly turned against Germany, and in addition to the unstoppable advance of the Red Army coming from the east to enter German territory from the west, there was a growing air offensive carried out by the Western Allies, the United States and England. But in January 1944, the command of the 8th U.S. Air Force in England was changed, and a very aggressive general named James Doolittle took command of that unit. Doolittle then allowed his P-51 Mustang fighter units to carry out fighter sweeps across occupied Europe, and between February 20 and 25, 1944, he launched an extremely important and intense campaign against the factories and workshops that supplied the Luftwaffe's fighters. So that week, several factories producing aircraft, engines, and parts for German planes were heavily hit, and the Mustangs searched the skies for targets and found them. The Luftwaffe, which tried to shoot down these aircraft, was almost entirely destroyed in the air by the large number of American fighters, which caused a drastic drop in the number of pilots available in the frontline units. And that's exactly where the fate of Eduard Schallmoser will cross paths with the General der Jagdflieger, or Inspector General of Fighters, General Adolf Galland. Galland had been Inspector General of Fighters since 1941, and in February of 1944, he started a very intense campaign to try to bring pilots from other branches, from the transport branch, the attack branch, and even from the Luftwaffe training units to the fighter front line. And of course, those pilots who were removed from those units would have to be replaced by new pilots. And then a major flight training campaign for new aviator candidates was launched. That's when Eduard Schallmoser gets the chance to train as a fighter pilot. By the end of that year, 1944, after flying his first combat aircraft solo, he would then be placed in flight training for a truly revolutionary aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, the first jet fighter to see action in history. Having flown for the first time in 1942, the Me-262 had its operational strategy delayed by Adolf Hitler's insistence on turning it into a fighter bomber. In other words, adding bomb-dropping capabilities to an aircraft that was originally designed to be a pure fighter, a high-speed interceptor. The Me-262 was about 160 km/h faster than the fastest Allied piston engine fighter, the Hawker Tempest, and was armed with cannons, no less than 4 30-millimeter cannons in the nose. Just so you know, the impact of a single shell like that was more than enough to bring down a 4-engine bomber like the American B-17. After a personal insistence from Adolf Galland, who clashed on this point with high-ranking Luftwaffe authorities like Hermann Göring, in April 1944, finally the Me-262 is put into combat. Frontline with the Erprobungskommando 262, an experimental operational unit that was supposed to define the guidelines for using the jet as a bomber interceptor. Shortly after that, Ace Walter Novotny leads a unit that also advances Me-262 training on the front line, a unit called Commando Novotny. And finally, towards the end of the year, Jägerschwader 7 begins to receive its first jets. However, the engines of the Me-262 are made from second-rate material with already recycled metal, and therefore it didn't provide the necessary alloy, the necessary resistance for continued operation under high pressure. These engines, then, were prone to failure after just 10 hours of use, making the acceleration and deceleration of the German jets an extremely slow process. With the drastic increase of Allied air presence over Germany in the second half of 1944, and even with the German aircraft industry fully committed to the production of fighters, it was clear that the Luftwaffe simply had no way now to stop those American bombing raids. But Hermann Göring, commander of the Luftwaffe, used this whole situation to openly criticize the fighter pilots, those same fighter pilots who, since 1940, had been facing those four-engine bombers entering German territory. And this tension led on January 19, 1945, to the famous fighter pilots' revolt. That was when the group of Experten, the most experienced fighter pilots and the top aces of the Luftwaffe, composed a single manifesto signed by all of them, demanding an immediate retraction of what they called slander by the top commander of the Luftwaffe. Göring, of course, did not take this news lightly. He was furious with this manifesto from the fighter pilots, and he believed that the main culprit behind that revolt was then Adolf Galland, the Inspector General of Fighter Aviation. So, what did he do to Galland? On January 31, 1945, he dismissed him from the position, putting someone nobody liked very much in his place, Gordon Golob. But since Hitler still respected Adolf Galland a lot, Hermann Göring then decided to give Galland the chance he had always asked for. He could now create a pure jet fighter unit with all the resources he wanted and all the pilots he wanted, and that's what Galland did. He started recruiting pilots from various units that no longer existed. Big names in German fighter aviation who, in the end, made up a 5-star unit full of ultra-experienced and successful pilots, which became known as Jagdverbund 44. Headquartered in the small town of Eining, near Berchtesgaden in Bavaria, at the start of March,
No comecinho de março de 1945,
Galland finally launched operations for JV-44, and besides recruiting great aces, he also recruited some very talented rookie pilots, and one of those pilots was precisely Eduard Schallmoser. Schallmoser then became nothing less than the wingman of the unit's commander. He started protecting Adolf Galland during fighter missions. He then took command of the Me-262, serial number 111,745, painted with white 5, called Weissfünf. Serial number, or manufacturing number, 111,745, painted with white 5, known as Weissfünf. On his first combat mission, which took place on March 4, 1945, Schallmoser didn't even fire a single shot at the enemies in the air, and he was criticized by his superiors for an alleged lack of aggressiveness. It was only 30 days after that, on April 3, 1945, that success finally smiled on Schallmoser. It was on that day, near the town of Riem, close to Munich, that he encountered a group of P-38 Lightnings from the 15th Air Force. And in the middle of the enemy formation, Schallmoser spotted the aircraft flown by Lieutenant William Randall. Instead of opening fire on the enemy from a safe distance, Schallmoser simply accelerated his jet, lost some control, and ended up crashing his plane into the P-38 fighter. The speed of the German jet was so great, and its inertia correspondingly so vast, that it simply sliced through the wing of the P-38 like a knife through butter, causing the American plane to go into a spin and the pilot, Lieutenant Randall, to bail out and become a prisoner of war. Schallmoser then managed to regain control of his jet, and even though it was damaged, he was able to fly it back to base. On April 16th, flying over the area of Lemberg, this time Schallmoser encountered a formation of Martin B-26 Marauder medium bombers. And again, despite opening fire on the American aircraft, he ended up colliding with the Marauder and shooting down the enemy plane. It almost seems like a joke, but the next day he returned. He did the same thing again, but this time against a much larger plane, the 4-engine American Boeing B-17. But since the plane was much bigger, it caused much more damage to the Me-262. And this time, Schallmoser landed the plane, but the Me-262 was considered damaged beyond any repair. Total loss. At this point in the story, after having shot down 3 large planes simply by ramming them in the air, Eduard Schallmoser earned the nickname Der Drama, or the Ram, from his colleagues. That old weapon, made of a large tree trunk suspended by ropes, which was used to hit the big gates of medieval fortresses to break them down. Our story reaches its climax on April 20, 1945, the 56th birthday of Adolf Hitler. On that day, Schallmoser once again took off as a la Germania, following the example of Adolf Galland. This time he went to fly over the city of Memmingen, his hometown. At that location, there was a group of B-26 Marauders from the U.S. 9th Air Force. Shortly after dropping their bombs on the target, the American Marauders found themselves under attack from the German jets. Galland led the swarm attack, that is, 4 Me-262s in a dive against the enemy formation. He dove down, firing his cannons, and simply blew Lieutenant Dale Sanders's B-26 out of the sky. Schallmoser was the 3rd Me-262 to pass through the formation during the dive, and was targeted by intense machine gun fire from no less than 6 Marauders. As he passed through the formation, incredibly, he managed to collide his tail assembly with the right engine propeller of Lieutenant James Hansen's B-26. In addition to having his jet completely riddled by machine gun fire, he lost his entire tail, and his Me-262 began to descend uncontrollably. Incredibly, Lieutenant Hansen managed to keep control of the bomber and even land it at the Trier Air Base, but the debris resulting from the collision ended up seriously damaging several other planes. Meanwhile, in the cockpit of the Me-262, Schallmoser realized that shrapnel had lodged in his leg, so he decided to exit the aircraft. He jettisoned the canopy, stood up, and separated from the Me-262, opening his parachute. While he was falling, he looked down and saw his aircraft explode as it crashed into the ground, but he had no control over his parachute. And by a huge coincidence, which involved a lot of luck and also the right gusts of wind, he ended up landing in his mother's backyard. Johanna Schallmoser was tending her garden when she saw that huge aerial battle unfolding above her house, and she followed with her eyes that pilot who was coming down. He ended up landing in her backyard and getting tangled in her clothesline. And when the young man removed the mask from his face, she was shocked to realize that it was her eldest son. And Johanna rushed to help Eduard Schallmoser, who was very sweaty and bleeding, sat him in a chair and tried to call the hospital, but realized that the phone line was cut due to the bombing. She then improvised bandages for her son's wounds, cleaned him up, and even cooked him a huge plate of pancakes. And after spending an unlikely but comfortable afternoon in his mother's company, Eduard Schallmoser was taken by a military vehicle to the nearby Luftwaffe hospital. While he was recovering, his commander, Adolf Gallin, was also wounded in action 6 days later, on April 26, passing command of the JG-24 to A.S. Heinz Reinsberg. After being discharged from the hospital and returning to the front line in early May 1945, Schallmoser saw almost no more action and surrendered to the Americans a few days later. After being released from captivity, Eduard Schallmoser was one of the many German veterans who emigrated to South America. He went to live in Argentina, started a family, and worked there throughout his life, eventually settling in the city of Oberá, in the province of Misiones, a few kilometers from the Brazilian border, where he died at the age of 68 on October 7, 1991. Amazing story, isn't it? Now tell me, did you already know about the incredible figure of Eduard Schallmoser, the German jet's battering ram, who crashed in his mother's backyard? Let us know in the comments. Want to learn more about the Luftwaffe? Sign up for our course, Luftwaffe from the First to the Last Day, by scanning the QR code or clicking the link in the description. I'll be waiting for you. If you enjoyed this video, then share it with your friends, and also give us a thumbs up. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to Sala de Guerra so you don't miss anything else. I'll stop here. Thank you again for watching, and here's a big hug from Sala de Guerra. War.